You're walking now, not through a palace, not a studio, but down a marketplace street at dawn. Vendors are setting up stalls, and the air smells like damp wood, citrus peels, and something metallic. You glance around. There are no royals here. No velvet. Just regular folks trying to survive another day. But then, tucked between a bread seller and a cart full of garlic, you spot something that stops you cold, a tray of tiny paint cakes, the kind artists used, each glinting faintly red in the sunrise, and just like that, we're deep in the underground world of the pigment market, because yes, even bug juice had a black market while nobles and cardinals flexed their cochineal-infused garments. Down here in the everyday world, the pigment passed through much grubbier hands. Apothecaries, alchemists, shady monks with suspiciously red fingers, cochineal traveled far beyond elite art. It became a kind of currency. Painters who couldn't afford gold leaf might trade a bit of rare red instead. There were even cases of apprentices stealing scraps of pigment from their masters to sell under the table, and here's where the Renaissance really starts to feel like a long episode of a gritty crime drama. Historians still argue whether pigment theft rings actually existed. Some records mention arrests for misappropriation of vermilion and carmine, but were these organized gangs? Or just desperate artists with sticky fingers? Whatever the truth, one thing's certain, in the art world, red meant status. And status could be stolen. You duck into a cramped workshop where 3 journeymen are hunched over a fresco panel, whispering like it's a card game. One of them dips a brush into a suspiciously small jar, eyes darting left and right. He's mixing it, carefully, with egg yolk, thinning it just enough to stretch the color but not lose its punch. Every drop of cochineal is gold dust. They're painting a chapel wall, but the contract only paid 4 earth tones. The red? That's a bonus. A risk. A rebellion. A way to impress future patrons. You watch them layer it into a saint's robe, knowing full well that in a few years, someone might accuse them of fraud, or worse, heresy. After all, what was divine color doing in unauthorized places? But that's the thing about color. It leaks. It spreads. It disobeys out on the streets. Color starts showing up in places it shouldn't. A ribbon here. A fresco there. A painted sign above a butcher's stall. Yes, even butchers wanted in on the drama. The line between sacred and mundane was getting blurrier by the brushstroke, and guess who noticed? The church. Cue dramatic organ music. See, the Catholic Church had a complicated relationship with pigments. On one hand, it adored rich color, especially red. Cardinals, remember, wore cochineal robes so bright they could cause sunburns. But at the same time, it preached humility, modesty, restraint. So when cochineal started sneaking into places outside approved use, like peasants' altars, street art, or even carnival costumes, tensions rose. Some bishops began issuing quiet warnings: avoid excess, don't glorify vanity, save crimson for the sacred. Others? They embraced it. Commissioned murals soaked in red. Paid extra for bolder hues. Historians still argue whether this was strategic spiritual marketing, or just ecclesiastical flexing. You slip into a small chapel. No one's here. Just candle smoke and the faint echo of an Ave Maria. The frescoes are faint now, faded by time and candle soot. But there, in the hem of Mary's robe, you catch it. A stubborn glimmer of carmine. Still clinging to the plaster after 400 years. That's the thing about cochineal, it didn't just color things. It outlived them, and that durability made it dangerous. Because if something was painted in carmine, it didn't fade like chalk or crumble like lime. It lasted. Long enough to outlive emperors. Long enough to survive regimes. Long enough to whisper messages centuries later, some holy, some not. Back outside, the street's alive now. A parade is passing through, masks, drums, laughter. One girl wears a red sash that nearly glows in the morning light. You wonder if her mother traded 2 loaves of bread for that scrap of dye. If some smuggler ground the Beetles behind a butcher's stall. If a journeyman swapped it under candlelight. If an artist begged for it, hoarded it, used it for just one unforgettable brushstroke, and suddenly, you're realizing how much red meant to everyone. To the bishop, it meant God.to the noble, it meant control.to the painter, it meant prestige.to the child in the street, it meant magic.to the bug? Well, it meant extinction. Sorry, beetle. Here's a quirky fact to round things out. Some apothecaries claim that ingesting trace amounts of cochineal could cure melancholy. Yes, crushed bugs in your tea to cure the blues. Probably placebo. Or maybe, just maybe, it worked because anything that vibrant had to chase away the gray, and now you're starting to understand how Renaissance Europe became obsessed, not just with the color, but with the idea of cochineal. It was exotic, dangerous, symbolic, and just a little bit illicit. It wasn't just a pigment, it was a secret, and like all secrets, it had a life of its own. You're walking through fog now, thick, rolling, the kind that sticks to your skin and makes every lantern glow like it's floating on its own. The cobblestones beneath your feet are damp, your breath curls in the cold air, and somewhere in the distance, bells toll midnight. But this isn't Europe anymore. No chapels, no powdered wigs. You've just landed in the shadows of a very different empire. Welcome to Asia. Specifically, the mysterious pigment trade routes that reached places like Mughal India, Safavid Persia, and even Imperial China. And yes, cochineal made it here, too. Though it arrived late to the party, when it did show up, it brought its usual drama. You duck into a Mughal marketplace. The smells hit you first: saffron, sandalwood, smoke, and cardamom. Jewels glitter under oil lamps, and silk merchants haggle with aristocrats over bolts of crimson fabric. Crimson that didn't quite exist a decade ago, because here's the thing, India already had an intense relationship with red. Madder root had been part of the textile tradition for thousands of years. The Mughal emperors bathed their courts in reds, oranges, and deep pinks. They even developed techniques to make those dyes sing. But when cochineal began to slip into the equation, smuggled by Portuguese traders or gifted in diplomatic exchanges, it caused a quiet revolution. Textile artisans in Gujarat began experimenting, mixing cochineal into their dye baths alongside madder and lac. The result? Reds so vibrant they were mistaken for divine intervention. Some called them God-dyed. Others were less thrilled. Traditional dyers feared the beetle-based pigment would make their ancient crafts obsolete. Historians still argue whether cochineal improved these traditions or steamrolled them. One artisan, whose name is lost to time, allegedly buried his entire dye vat in protest, swearing never to touch the foreign bug. A bold move, though not very practical. Meanwhile, over in Persia, Safavid weavers weren't nearly so hesitant. Cochineal became a favorite for luxury carpets. Imagine kneeling on a prayer rug that took a year to weave, every thread hand-dyed, some with pigment that crossed oceans and empires just to get here. Suddenly, your living room rug has better travel stories than you do, and in China, the situation was even more layered. The Ming and early Qing dynasties already had cinnabar and kermes at their disposal, plus a uniquely Chinese aesthetic when it came to red, more restrained, more symbolically potent. Red was joy, luck, imperial authority. So when samples of cochineal began showing up via Jesuit missionaries and Portuguese traders, Chinese artisans were intrigued but cautious. They tested it, toyed with it. Some even blended it with traditional lac to enhance their lacquerware. But full adoption? That was slow. China didn't like being reliant on foreign imports, especially ones so hard to trace. Still, a few high-ranking officials, curious about European methods, began commissioning pieces with subtle cochineal accents. Blink and you'd miss it, but the color was there, hidden in silk embroidery, or in the lining of an imperial robe. Now here's a fringe tidbit for your sleepy brain. There's a long-standing rumor that one of the Forbidden City's smaller throne rooms had cochineal-painted murals, smuggled in by Jesuit painters under orders from a curious Qing emperor. Of course, no one's confirmed it. The room was sealed after a fire sometime in the 18th century and hasn't been opened since. Maybe it's just a legend. Maybe not, but one thing's for sure, cochineal didn't just travel. It infiltrated. It snuck into every culture it touched, whispering through pigments and passing itself off as something familiar. And you wonder, how many of the great Eastern reds you see in museums are actually part Spanish beetle, you trail your fingers along a silk scroll in a merchant's tent. The red ink glistens in the lamplight. It looks ancient. But now you know, it might also be global. The pigment's ability to cross both borders and belief systems was uncanny. In India, it brushed against gods. In Persia, it mingled with poetry. In China, it flirted with the imperial court. This was no ordinary dye, it was a shapeshifter, and all the while, in the background, European traders were counting coins. They watched as crates of crushed beetle cakes left Veracruz and arrived in Goa, or Basra, or Macau. The Dutch East India Company, never ones to miss a financial opportunity, tried to muscle in on the trade. The English tried too, but they were late to the game and often ended up fighting each other instead. Historians still argue whether these pigment exports had deeper geopolitical effects. Did cochineal help fund wars? Did it buy alliances? Did it buy betrayals? No one's sure. But the timelines, well, they match up uncomfortably well. You lean against a temple wall now, the sound of evening prayers echoing across a river. Somewhere behind you, a textile worker dips a bolt of cotton into a vat, then lifts it to the air. The fabric glows, brighter than sunset. Maybe it's madder. Maybe it's beetle. But in this moment, it's just red, and as night settles, you realize the world is smaller than it feels. Tiny beetles, plucked from cacti in Mexico, have found their way into the hands of weavers, painters, and poets half a planet away, and you? You're holding the thread that ties them all together. You find yourself stepping back into the chaotic, dusty streets of a Renaissance city, Venice, specifically. The city of canals, masked balls, and mercantile mayhem. You could almost hear the slap of gondolas against wooden docks and smell the salty sea mixed with freshly baked bread. But your eyes are drawn to a tiny shop squeezed between a tailor and a spice merchant. It's crammed floor to ceiling with pigments, powders, and strange tools. Welcome to the world of Renaissance pigment alchemists, the true magicians of color. Here, the transformation of crushed beetles into the perfect crimson wasn't just a mechanical process, it was part science, part artistry, and part secret ritual. These alchemists operated behind closed doors, guarding their recipes like state secrets. The exact methods of extracting carminic acid from the tiny cochineal bugs varied, sometimes subtly, sometimes drastically, from one city to another. Some soaked the bugs in vinegar, others crushed them into a fine powder, then mixed them with potash or alum to fix the color. Each recipe was a guarded family treasure. You imagine the scene: an alchemist hunched over a copper basin, stirring the deep red sludge by candlelight. His hands stained a vivid scarlet, his breath fogging in the cold air. This wasn't just a job, it was an obsession. Because the quality of the pigment meant everything. The difference between a dull, muddy red and a glowing scarlet could make or break a commission, a career, even a city's reputation. And there's a fun, somewhat bizarre fact you wouldn't expect: some alchemists believed that the bugs themselves held magical properties, and they incorporated various herbs, incense, or even bits of precious metals into their mixtures to enhance the pigment's potency. One Venetian recipe calls for the addition of crushed pearls and the blood of a white pigeon, a practice that sounds more like a witch's brew than paint production. Historians still argue whether these superstitions genuinely influenced pigment quality or if they were just psychological boosters, early placebo effects for painters desperate to make their colors last. But there's no denying the cult-like reverence for cochineal among pigment makers. Meanwhile, as these pigment masters worked their alchemy, the city's painters eagerly awaited their shipments. Without the perfect carmine, a portrait could lose its spark. The fiery blush of a noblewoman's cheek, the vivid drapery of a saint's robe, the deep blood-red banner fluttering in a battle scene, each demanded pigment of the highest caliber. Venetian painters were among the first to elevate carmine to an art form. Titian, the grand master of Venetian color, exploited the pigment's brilliant hues to create some of the most breathtaking reds ever captured on canvas. You can almost see the brush strokes. The reds seem to pulse with life, but there's a little-known controversy hiding behind these masterpieces. Some scholars argue that Titian and his contemporaries mixed cochineal with other reds like madder or cinnabar to achieve their signature effects. This raises the question: was the perfect red really a pure beetle product, or an alchemist's blend? You pause at a faded fresco of the Last Supper, where the robes glow with a muted red. The pigment has aged unevenly, leaving traces of earlier mixtures beneath the surface. It's a silent witness to centuries of experimentation, adaptation, and debate. And speaking of debate, here's a quirky tidbit to chew on while you relax. Venetian alchemists reportedly used tiny mechanical devices, early versions of pestles and mortars powered by water wheels, to crush the beetles on an industrial scale. It sounds like a steampunk fantasy, but a few workshop records mention beetle crushers powered by the city's waterways. The bugs literally met their fate in the rhythm of the canals. This early mechanization not only increased pigment production but also sparked ethical questions. Were the bugs simply raw materials, or creatures deserving of respect? Renaissance thinkers dabbled in such philosophical musings, though practical concerns usually won. Your gaze shifts to a narrow canal window where a painter's apprentice carefully mixes pigment with egg yolk, the classic technique of tempera painting. The apprentice's hands tremble slightly, unsure if today's batch will meet the master's high standards. The alchemist's potion, the painter's brush, the apprentice's hope, all intertwined in the quest for the perfect red. You're struck by how this pigment, born from tiny insects and exotic lands, became a central player in Renaissance art's greatest stories. It was a color that carried the weight of empires, the whispers of alchemists, and the dreams of painters desperate to make something eternal. And as you step back into the street's fading light, you realize something: cochineal wasn't just pigment or trade good. It was an obsession. A magic trick. A political statement. And, above all, a reminder that even the smallest creatures can leave the biggest marks. The city's noise fades as you find yourself inside a dimly lit gallery, a private collection filled with canvases shimmering under candlelight. The paintings seem to breathe, their reds glowing as if freshly painted, despite the centuries layered upon them. You realize you're walking through the aftermath of the pigment's journey, the art itself. The story of cochineal is inseparable from the art it colored, and here, you glimpse how this crimson helped shape not just visuals, but meaning. Painters didn't just want a color, they wanted the color that would captivate, move, even manipulate. In Renaissance Europe, red symbolized power, passion, and divinity. A cardinal's robe wasn't merely a garment, it was a declaration of authority and piety. The Virgin Mary's cloak wasn't just fabric, it was a visual hymn. And cochineal gave artists a new vocabulary, a way to paint with passion literally extracted from insects. But it wasn't all reverence. Red also carried danger. There was an unspoken tension between its beauty and its origins, between the reverence for the sacred and the sordid reality of its production. Some artists used cochineal to portray saints and martyrs, saturating their robes with deep reds to evoke sacrifice and purity. Others, however, used it to paint scandalous scenes, the lush red dresses of courtesans, the fiery blood of battle, or the simmering anger of political unrest. You remember the fresco you saw earlier, painted with subtle cochineal blends. It's a silent debate in itself. Was the painter emphasizing holy sacrifice or worldly power? Art historians still argue whether the use of cochineal marked a shift in Renaissance art toward a more emotional, expressive style, or if it was simply a technical advancement. Either way, cochineal's impact on art was undeniable. Here's a quirky detail: some artists mixed cochineal with white lead to create subtle pinks and flesh tones. Yes, those delicate blushes on a cheek or the warm glow of a hand, meaning the bug's color literally touched the skin of history's most famous faces. But it's not just painters who loved cochineal. Fashion designers, tailors, and textile artists adored it too. Red fabrics dyed with cochineal became status symbols, coveted by kings and commoners alike. The color was so valuable that sumptuary laws were enacted, dictating who could wear what shade of red. Wearing cochineal red without permission could land you in serious trouble. You glance at a portrait of a noblewoman whose crimson gown practically leaps from the canvas. That red is more than pigment, it's a story of trade, politics, and human desire. And speaking of desire, did you know some Renaissance poets compared cochineal red to the blush of first love? The way the pigment's glow seemed to pulse was said to inspire passion in both painters and viewers alike. A bit dramatic? Sure. But hey, this is the Renaissance. You lean closer to a painting of a saint, noting the intricate layering of red hues. The pigment's brilliance has survived centuries, a testament to the Beatles' stubborn legacy. And as you step back, you realize this pigment didn't just color art, it colored emotion, identity, and history itself. A tiny bug's secret transformed human expression forever. You're now seated in a quiet study, the flicker of a single candle casting soft shadows over piles of aged manuscripts and faded sketches. This is the place where the story of Cochineal's legacy unfolds in its final, lingering chapter, a reflection on its enduring impact, the mysteries it still holds, and the echoes it leaves in our modern world. By now, you've seen how a tiny insect, crushed and ground into pigment, could ripple through continents and centuries. But what happened after the Renaissance? Did cochineal fade quietly into the past? Far from it. In fact, cochineal's influence only grew. It became a staple of global commerce, a crucial ingredient in industries ranging from textiles to cosmetics. The British and French industrial revolutions relied on it to supply the booming fashion markets, while early photographers experimented with it in photo dyes. Cochineal's brilliant red even made its way into military uniforms, hospital linens, and the lips of flappers in the Roaring Twenties. And here's a curious modern twist. In recent decades, as synthetic dyes have replaced natural ones, cochineal has experienced a surprising comeback. Natural food colorings are in demand, and cochineal-based carmine is widely used in everything from yogurt to lipstick, although it's caused a few allergic reactions and scandals, leading to some strict labeling laws. Historians still argue about cochineal's cultural symbolism. Was it purely a luxury item, or did it carry deeper social and political meanings across different societies? Was it a symbol of colonial exploitation or global interconnectedness? Maybe it was both. One thing's certain, cochineal teaches us about the unexpected ways nature and culture intertwine. How a beetle from a cactus in Mexico could color the robes of a Venetian cardinal or the silks of a Mughal emperor. And here's a final fringe tidbit for you. There are still tiny communities in Mexico that harvest cochineal by hand, preserving ancient methods passed down for centuries. In these places, the pigment isn't just a commodity, it's a living tradition, a thread connecting past and present. You close the dusty book in front of you, feeling the weight of history in your hands. The world of cochineal is a perfect example of mystery history, a tale full of surprises, strange connections, and tiny creatures that changed the course of art, commerce, and culture. Now, as you prepare to drift off, think about the colors around you. How many of them carry stories you'll never guess? And maybe, just maybe, one of those colors came from a crushed beetle. Now, let's gently wind down. The night settles softly around you. The stories slow, their edges blurring into quiet warmth. You feel the weight of history ease from your mind, replaced by a gentle curiosity that hums quietly like a distant lullaby. The tiny beetles, the painters, the traders, they're all tucked away now, resting beneath layers of time and memory. Breathe in slowly. Let the soft reds, the glowing crimsons, and the whispered secrets of centuries fade like the last candle flame. Your eyelids grow heavy. The world narrows to the gentle hum of a fan, the quiet rhythm of your own breath, and as sleep takes you, remember, history isn't just dates and facts. It's color. It's scent. It's the stories woven between the smallest things and the grandest moments. You've just touched one of those threads tonight. Sweet dreams.